Welcome to Evolution Hour. Our exciting opening logo. And don't forget the website. Okie doke. This is our 300th show, which means we have been blathering on for almost a year's worth of weeks. Isn't that absolutely amazing? This show began in part from the inspiration from the late Strike, who talked me into doing videos, and we came up with the Evolution Hour idea. I think that was actually Strike's moniker. And here we are 300 episodes later with a few occasional blips in the kinds of the holidays. Hopefully we will be able to do continuous episodes through the holidays, even though I will be out of town during all of that. But we have people who have high-speed internet access to continue on, as I have often done. At any rate, this one is continuing the chapter on kinds, which is still an amazingly vague operation. They're throwing in cats and the usual shtick of generic material. They're not really citing any baraminology literature. It's all the surface level stuff from creation.com CMI. So the insularity of this is really quite amazing. One is an old crusty thing from 2001, Catchpool and Wieland, on speedy speciation, which is perfectly fine. No one's arguing that individual species can't differentiate, especially in things like insects and lizards and others, where there's no morphological change going on particularly, but just changes in breeding circumstances or pheromones or relatively little minor tweaks. This is way removed from the definitions of kinds, which is what exactly is the limit on how much speciation that you can do. And if it goes on long enough, can't you breach the boundaries of kinds? Well, the creationists are never going to bump into that because they avoid looking at the intersection areas, as I went into in quite a chunk in Evolution Slam Dunk, and we allude to it in The Rocks Were There. Links for all of that in the description every week. And so their obsession with this, quite a lot of it comes from more Catchpool, 2001 piece on donkeys, 2015 piece on cats, which I thought was particularly interesting because, oh, hello, Hendril, good morning. Because Catchpool is riffing off of a 2007 paper by Driscoll on the Near Eastern origin of cat domestication, which when you read the Catchpool stuff, isn't going into too much detail, but fortunately the paper is available. And that's where you can find out that the framework for that domestication is going back way into the developments of agriculture. So the earliest stages of it, where they actually have an example mentioned in the paper of what are putatively domesticated cat evidence from, I think, Crete from 7500 BCE, which is, just in case you need the news bulletin, about 3,500 years before the creation of the universe in the young Earth creationist model. So it's yet another example of, if you pare things down enough and leave out enough data, then gosh, the kinds look extremely detailed. Now, the bulk of this particular show today is not going to be about good old Sarfati and Tay. And I suspect that the remaining weeks in the month will be further dangling of some of the newer material that they are citing along the way in this vacuous chapter on kinds. But what came up on a different angle was a video from last August with somebody from the ICR, Institute for Creation Research video. And this one was Mark Stengler proclaiming that Darwinism is dead. In fact, he was repeating that Darwinism is dead a lot in the video. But based on what? I hadn't really seen this Stengler much guy before, but boy, was it a pile of overreaching crap. One, it was bringing up the infamous 2018 Stuckley and Thaler paper, which didn't actually show what the creation anti-evolutionists want at all. This one I'll be putting a link up to Joel Duff commenting on it, as well as a thing from Michael Marshall from 2018 that was going into it. The paper itself isn't open access, or I haven't been able to find it there, so we won't be linking to that thing. But they were trying to argue that there was a big burst of speciation in the last, say, 6,000 years based upon some genetic analysis that they have been favoring, which isn't really one that's terribly well known or used much in the regular scientific community. So it's a dicey little framework as well. But beyond that, they weren't claiming that all the species had originated only 6,000 years ago frame, only that some speciation events had occurred in some examples during that period in relation to things that are currently extant. So their argument, first of all, was a data selection that was not very good. And two, they weren't actually defending a young Earth creationist model where everything has to be really, really young. So, boop. The second paper that Stengler drew on was an allusion to Lenski's long-term E. coli experiments, and repeating the usual stuff about citrate evolution and it still being a bacterium, blah, blah, blah. In Rocks for Their Volume 1, we went into that whole Lenski issue. Hello, Lisa. We went into that whole Lenski issue in, I hope, mind-numbing detail to list off the various work that Lenski's team has been doing over all those years, and how just a smattering of it gets mentioned in the anti-evolution literature, some of it by young Earth creationists and some of it over in the intelligent design camp. But boy, are they persnickety about what little bits and pieces they deal with. And we, in particular, went into some serious problems that some of the creationists had in misrepresenting the Lenski material and other works that had come along subsequently that they were just mind-bogglingly wrong on. So the third paper that gets dangled by Stengler in this ICR video is from somebody that I wasn't aware of at all. So I'm always delighted when I encounter some people that are orbiting the creationist camp that are new names on the block. This one was Olin, Brown, and Hollander 2022. And alas, it's not available open access yet. But the listing that I can give you at Science Direct gives a lot of the stuff, because you can see some of the references and you can see the main abstract and a lot of the conclusions. So there's a big chunk of what's going on in there that you can take a look at it. Anyway, their point is that neo-Darwinism, as in a kind of an origins or bust mode Krebs cycle obsession, and also the Cambrian, somehow is mathematically impossible to the tune of 10 to the 50th power. Oh, well, that settles that, Darwinism. My jaw drops open at that point as to how the hell do you make such a calculation on that? With the Krebs cycle, of course, we're knee-deep in early stages of how biochemical systems are operating. In fact, there's some arguments that if I ever do a book on the origins or bust thing, I'd want to have a neat little section on the Krebs cycle, which there's a good issue that some of this stuff is a cyclical system that has been just flipped around and runs backwards. And that's some of these biological systems have come about by that bit. And I think the Krebs cycle was one of them. But anyway, the paper itself was really neat to deal with, because it was stuff that circulates around areas that I hadn't encountered before, and in particular regarding how creationists have been playing with this information. The Brown and Hollander work has been fielded by Brian Thomas in 2022. I'll be putting the link into that from ICR. Casey Luskin waved off it in 2023 over at Evolution News. Jason Matera in that same year put a post up at christianpost.com, who was basically riffing off of the Luskin account as for, quote, the latest scientific literature, unquote. And then also a 1996 Henry Morris piece was being waved by Matera from ICR about difference between macroevolution and microevolution, which again repeats the notion that you can't have macroevolution because the microevolution doesn't add up to all that. Not one of those accounts in just getting little menus coming up on my screen here. Not one of those accounts, the Luskin, the Matera, and the Thomas, mentioned the fact that Brown was a creationist. And it was not immediately obvious that he was a creationist by what you would see from the Brown and Hollander paper or from the secondary accounts. But Googling a little bit about Brown helped clarify it. There's also another paper from 2023 where they're still riffing off of this argument about the impossibility of evolution. This one's from 2023, and again, only a portion of it's available, but you'll be able to get a good section of what it's about on the Science Direct link that I'll be putting up. Anyway, their follow-up insists, quote, complex multifactorial change is required for speciation events, unquote. No. It would be helpful if either one of them had paid close attention. Henry Morris, the grandfather of creationism. Yes, Lisa, that was one of the pieces that was being riffed off by Matera in 2023 at the Christian Post. He was just dangling this little bit. How closely he was really realizing who Henry Morris was, I don't know. But anyway, this new paper had a weird set of sources. And remember, this material is just what can be seen online. It isn't, because it's so recent, it's not available in any way I can get to for full text material. But from what I could see was curious, because one of the sources in this 2023 paper apparently is about G.K. Chesterton and an anti-Darwinist statement he made. But when you check the link that's involved, guess what? It's Toledo Sanders at creation.com. So it's not exactly a scholarly paper on G.K. Chesterton's anti-Darwinism. And that was channeling some obsolete 1920s Chesterton stuff. I mean, the what good is a half a wing argument and all that material. And a few obsolete newer ones like our, drumroll, Sanford's genetic entropy, which, as Jackson and I are taking great pains to call attention to in The Rocks Were There, is not a thing. Genetic entropy is not a real biological phenomenon, even though it's constantly being repeated. And we'll be having a nice little segment in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, where we'll be bringing some up-to-date about just exactly why genetic entropy is not going anywhere, because there's been some recent material, including an absolutely scathing analysis by Zach Hancock, who is a geneticist, who just ripped into it in great detail. Anyhow, adding to the fog, in the same journal that Brown and Hollander 2023 was in, there was an article by Miller 2023, again a partial one, and it's cited, the only case I can see of somebody citing that 2022 Brown and Hollander paper so far, in a work furthering, quote, cognition-based biology, unquote, which may sound like something to the people who wrote it, but I haven't a clue what the hell they're talking about. Cognition-based biology. Are you supposed to be thinking about biology? I think that's entirely, I hope you are in a state of cognitive coherence when you're doing biology. But what that's supposed to be is unclear. And it's bypassing the fact that biology is naturalistic and evolutionary. So the fact that this Miller paper, even though it's talking about cognition-based biology, still sounds like it's proceeding from an evolutionary framework, so may not get waved at by the Discovery Institute or the ICR. So you got this new player then who's running at the fringe zone of creationism that's fielded by that. Take their rates of deterioration, Adam would have had like 4 times the DNA we have. What a joke. Oh, yeah. This is relating to another issue that's extremely significant in the whole created heterozygosity, double bottleneck problem of young Earth creationism. Has to do with the actual genomes. You still find an awful lot of obsession about the genome size issue, which was something that was a much bigger deal 30, 40, 50 years ago, which was the arbitrary assumption that organisms that are more complex will have way bigger genomes. So if you want to look at primitive organisms, they'll be really small, and complex organisms will be big. Well, that's before it dawned on them that you had, hello, Purple. That's before you dawned on them that you have a pile up of gene duplications and introns and redundant information, and that most of the genome relates to stuff involving regulatory sequences and padding and all of this mess, alternative splicing, which means that the idea that bigger organisms have more complex organisms translate into more genes, yeah, no. You can have, onions, I think, have one of the most gigantic genomes, way bigger than the typical vertebrate. And it's because plants often do that gene duplication bit. So things are much more complicated than that. But if you're coming at it from a creationist perspective, you have a very different difficulty. And that is all extant species must have not merely come through the bottleneck of Noah's Ark, of the critters on the Ark, although because they don't think about arthropods and marine organisms and stuff, there's the vast majority of life on the planet is not stuff that's going to be on the Ark. But whatever was on the Ark, therefore, not only was through that Ark element, but is only like a thousand years or so after creation. And 1600 years typically is the thing that you come up with when you look at Bishop Ussher. So all creation takes place in the creation week. The kinds are created with their genome. How many? 2? A population? The Bible is exceedingly vague on this subject because, spoiler alert, it's not a science book. But at any rate, whatever those genomes were and however many organisms you had involved in a population of them, that's the only thing you have to work on, because no new creation takes place. Now, creationists are in kind of a wibble-wobbly mode as to how much mutation can occur. They're kind of not denying that mutation happens. They're kind of not denying that natural selection can act on that, although move over to the ICR and Guliusa. No, he's not arguing that there's any of that. This is all pre-programmed material in the created genomes. Adequate food supply with the termites. Yeah, yes, indeed. That's why there's no Ark available, that it was just about to the point where the timbers, or that gopher wood, maybe gopher wood is preternaturally resistant to termites. But the critters then that are on the Ark, all of their genomes has to be in extant organisms, but they also have the problem with the diversity that we see before the Ark itself, which is all the critters that are dying out during the flood. So if you have an original created kind and it proliferates as a population, Joel Duff has brought this up in some of his videos as well, which ones are they picking for the Ark? You're obviously looking at only a sampling of the genome for the pair or 7 or whatever that you carry on the Ark, depending upon whether it's a clean or unclean animal. However that is, that's a fixed quantity. And now you have to deal with those kinds proliferating into the forms that we have now. Don't expect ever there to be any technical literature at Answers Research Journal or the Journal of Creation or the presentations that they do at the various creationist conferences that are held every so often, giving really point-blank, detailed genetic analyses of what the original created kinds had to have in their genome. Very different from what goes on in the regular evolutionary community, where if you have a set of organisms today that are regarded as fairly close cousins, boy, the geneticists will jump right in and start retro-calculating in some cases to work out what their genomes would have had or what particular versions of genes they must have had in order to be able to account for the versions that you have. In one obvious case of a speciation event, they had a variety of organisms a particular species where I think it had developed into a parthenogenetic form. But at any rate, they had the parthenogenic model, and it had to have originated from a non-parthenogenic one, and they were able to infer what the genome of that was based on what they could see in the form that was surviving in this particular population mix. And later on, they discovered that cousin, and bingo, it fit what they were dealing with. That happens all the time. When are we going to see that in the creationist movement? The most obvious case that they would want to do is Adam and Eve. Here you have the human genome. You've got Nathaniel Jensen and John Sanford and Robert Carter and all that bunch burrowing into the genomes right and left. What was the Adam and Eve genome? Did they have ALUs in their genome? We do. How many? Which? Where? Were any of them non-functional, as most of the ones in our genome are? And not just that, all the other retrotransposons. How does all that work? And the idea that you could have a highly heterozygous genome that is just cluttered up in Adam and Eve or any created kind organism, sufficient to be able to account for what we can see happening afterwards and showing up in the genomes of extant organisms, don't ever expect them to work that puzzle out. In the same way that we're never going to see a viable creationist biogeographical listing of what the continents really look like in the pre-flood world or the created world, and what changes were taking place and how fast and what critters were in there and how they were distributing after the flood and all of that. No, never going to work. Oh, why are the dinosaurs thousands of year old human ones are? Yeah, exactly that. Unless you go far enough back into millions of years for the case of Australopithecines and all of that. Exactly so. This is there's going to be a very big section in Rocks 2 about the whole soft tissue bit. And this is independent, but a nested issue from the whole why are things fossilized only at certain points? And why aren't things as spectacularly preserved as we can see in more recent things? LTEE, the Iceman, is going to come up. The issues of extremely well-preserved mastodons and the like that are in permafrost and such like, that the DNA in them doesn't deteriorate as fast, and there's calculations on all of that. And of course, creation is coming in after the fact, and they mangle the papers and they dangle stuff that's 20 years old and just go wild abandon on these things. But why isn't there a dinosaur that's as well preserved as LTEE the Iceman? Even beyond the issue of preservation is the issue of why aren't there fossil graveyards on the scale that creationists think? If you go back, for those of us old enough to remember the Duane Gish, Henry Morris brand of apologetics back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the stuff that got the original young earth creationism bandwagon going when they were trying to get legislation through to teach it in schools, that they were paying a big deal to fossil graveyards coming in the flood. And I, already by then sufficiently familiar with an awful lot of paleontology papers, recognized most fossils aren't in fossil graveyards. They're rare. They're so rare that they're like, wow, they're Lagerstätten deposits, that they're almost uniquely related to unusual ocean chemistry or anoxic conditions in lakes that have bad drainage, or unusual issues of landslides coming down and filling something in, or masses of volcanic ash coming along, which of course is not typical for underwater in a flood now, is it? Yes. Well, the rationales of why we don't see humans and dinosaurs together is quite hilarious. For one thing, what surprises me is how little they think about it. That although there are a few apologetic pieces that bring it up, it's not a lot. And we'll be alluding to those in the new book. But arguably, what they mainly argue is that they would try to argue that most things aren't fossilized. They suddenly go naturalistic, a lot of them, to where, well, most things don't get fossilized at all. Okay. Even if you grant the idea that humans and dinosaurs were interacting with each other and yet don't get fossilized together in the way that we see human fossil sites where they've also got tons of bones of the critters they were eating. Why aren't we finding a dinosaur in that? What, did they not like it? Did it taste too much like chicken for them? Hard to say. But the larger issue is not just humans and dinosaurs, it's humans and anything, or even worse, the marine fossils. Why is it that not one single bloody whale or dolphin or seal gets washed into the same spot as a plesiosaur or an anomalocard from the Cambrian? They're occupied stratigraphically, often in the same areas. Why isn't that the case? Why? Because they didn't live at the same time. That's why. That there's no way for some dog paddling early whale to go swimming in to nuzzle up against to a plesiosaur or be washed together in the churning massive muck that's going along in just the North America region or just the European region or any of these other places where you have these fossils in there. There's remarkably little finesse on that point. If the flood really happened, we should find tons of fossils. Certainly, we would find tons of brilliantly preserved fossils. Lagerstätten would be the ubiquitous phenomenon rather than the exception. And we would also find a mush of things because functionally everything lives at the same time. So everything is all going to get jumbled up together. If they want to bring in hydrologic sorting, fine and dandy, but that would mean that you would find certain sizes of organisms all across the range of life, all taking place in the same context. That's not what we find. Humans would never have survived against the 7-foot penguins. Not only that, the dino birds and some of these really big killer predatory flightless birds that we find that were the major predators in South America until the arrival of felids when the Isthmus of Panama opened up and critters started coming in from North America. All that faunal interchange stuff, which brings us back to the archaeology issue. Oh, let me also put in our patrons, which I forgot to do in all of my blither blather here, to remind everybody how much I appreciate all the support that I've gotten and people hanging on in times of travail and financial concerns and ups and downs and pandemics and everything else that we've got going. I can easily understand why it's tough to pull all of that little thing off. Obviously, more patrons that help in the thing in any way, shape, or form that you can add yourself to the mix, I will be uber appreciative of all of that because it makes everything easier as a retiree trying to do all of this on the sidebar budget that I don't have the sort of real estate and finances that the numbskulls at Answers in Genesis and the like do. I mean, they can afford to build the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum and pay Ken Ham $150,000 a year. Steve Meyer pulls down about that as well over at the Discovery Institute. What great work they have to do. And meanwhile, patrons and my little trickle of book revenue and my Social Security, that's what I got to live on. Once in a while, maybe even a paid speech, which I have done on occasion and done quite nicely as well. I reported on it in earlier shows. As a little sidebar, if anybody thinks I would be a great lecturer, if they can pay my way there and if they can give me a little stipend on the sidebar, I will deliver. And I can do it on an awful lot of topics, anything in relation to the creation evolution issue and scientific methodology and the cultural history of lots of stuff. I have a pretty big pile up of bits in my thing. And what I tend to do, I like to have about 20 to 30 minute speech and then hour and a half, 2 hours or more until they turn the lights off of Q&A. And I build off of all of that on a very specialized topic like the one that I did that I got paid for, on a lecture with a bunch of international seminar people that were coming in on the development of agnosticism and atheism in the culture and that background. I supplied reference bibliography and a chronology of the various factors involved that I could have as a handout for everybody to deal with. And I would be doing exactly that sort of thing on any kind of a speech in that I was dealing with. I want to spread the knowledge, and we have so much of it to deal with. So anybody know anything about that at your college or a secular group or whatever, and you don't want to have to shell out the big bucks for a Richard Dawkins? Unavailable. There we go. Okay. Yeah, the terror birds of South America didn't get nearly enough press. Yeah. Well, they're a niche area in general. And remember, you've got what the public media presents about a topic and versus what's going on in the field in question. The terror birds are relatively niche critters. And again, they are extinct. If you're talking about people who are keen on bird evolution and the like, and you look at postings that you get with Darren Naish over the years, he's going to bring them up and does material on it. But they're not necessarily the kind of thing that's being popped up in relation to, oh, the important new fossil that is found. Whereas dinosaurs and human evolution, frankly, get kind of all the squeaky wheel. Spinosaurus, yep. That's another one of the fascinating ones. Still largely fragmentary. For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, just think kind of a T-Rexy sort of a thing with a big fin back on the back. And it's still not entirely clear why all of that. The fin back features pop up in various lineages that are only distantly related to one another. The usual suspicion is they come in relation to thermal regulation. It is interesting that Spinosaurus lived in, I think, in the Egyptian area, as where some of the fossils are found, and it was arid at the time they were there. Ouranosaurus and a few others over in the hadrosaur side, they had these kind of fin-backy kind of things. And so it's thought partially that it would be thermal regulatory. It can also be sexual displays. That's another possibility. And it could be a combination of both. So I think if anybody had a time machine to go back and look, I'm sure you would, if you saw them in their natural habitat, you'd be going, well, duh. They're also interesting because they were apparently piscivorous. They were fish eaters. So it sounds like there's kind of a habitat that, think a really big Kodiak bear that's coming down and sloshing into the rivers and taking its fill of fish. I think it would be absolutely fascinating to see them in their natural environment. If they were on the island instead of dodos, they wouldn't be extinct. Problem was dodos didn't fight back. Yeah, that's always the problem about any organism that exists in a sheltered environment where they cease to have any natural predators, and then a natural predator comes along. In the case of the dodo, it was because the natural predator came in boats. And so the advent of humans accelerated the process of extinguishing species that they bumped into. And it's still a tremendously hot topic issue as to how much of the mass extinction that was taking place in mammalian fauna after the Ice Age waned was due to the arrival of human beings. There is a general coincidence that when humans show up, regardless of what time scale, when they show up, you start seeing a drop-off in the various fauna involved. This isn't necessarily because they were overhunting. It's that they are more efficient hunters and more selective hunters. Certainly in the case of the big proboscideans, there's a really good argument that can be made that they're difficult to hunt, but all you need to do, which ones are you going to attack if you're a human being? Are you going to go after the humongous mastodon or the baby mastodon? And so if you can cull out the children in a herd that are easier to get at, and you can still get a lot of meat off of them. The problem is that pachyderms have relatively long gestation times, and they have relatively few babies in the course of things. So what you may be doing then is cutting off that new generation to where the survival of the species can't continue because there are too few youngsters to deal with. Yeah, the chronology on the extinction thing is very interesting because you start seeing this in relation to the spread of human beings into areas in Asia, the arrival along the archipelagos and into Australia, obviously the arrival of humans in South America, North America and South America. That puts another variant on the thing. And so my suspicion is that it's a mix of environmental change because of the shifting environment due to the ice age, both warming up areas that hadn't been warm before. It's not merely just the disappearance of ice age, and critters migrating into new environments. At the same time that human beings are a little bit better hunting them, especially with atlatls and all the little hunting material. And all of that, all you have to do is to bring a population below its dynamic survival rate, and boop, disappears off the scope. But yet others survived. The bison, which are truculent animals that are very herd-oriented and not easily hunted, and the Native Americans got into quite an interesting dynamic relationship as to how they regarded them as such a core group, and in part because they were the ones that survived down into more recent times. Yes, R.I.P. Glyptodon. Yes, I have a little model of Glyptodon, which is that monstrous armadillo-y thing from, I don't know, remember what period it's from, Eocene, Miocene, somewhere in there. So I believe from South America. I think Darwin probably saw some fossils of it because he, of course, would poke around on the Beagle voyage. Wherever he landed, he was a hypergeology nut. And so he was looking at the geology of wherever he was and trying to find out everything he could about what people knew about extinct animals in that period. And that's in that time frame in the 1830s when the idea of extinction is really starting to take hold. So they're just primed to look at the fossil record on a much greater scale than they had been before. So it was a tremendously exciting time, but at the same time, the early 19th century was, from our standards today, a very confused period for them because they lacked a lot of the tools we would have. The techniques for excavation were much less sophisticated. So people were kind of looking at the thing and pulling the bone out, but not necessarily being so fussy about the context of it. So an awful lot of the information that might have been gleaned had modern archaeological and paleontological procedures been in play 100 years ago, and 200 years ago, wasn't. So we work with what we can. The roly-poly is a fascinating creature, yeah. Fair to say that virtually every major lineage has a much more diverse history than is typically appreciated. So the fact that as more and more paleontology is done, what kind of surprises me is how varied bird forms are in the late Cretaceous, and that a whole bunch of lineages that were doing a lot of flapping prior to the KT extinction, of which only the ornithines make it through, and all of the others go extinct. Was that luck of the draw, or some dynamic circumstance that they had that the enantiornithines and the weird little sidebar ones, like the little part bat-wingy feathered critters, Gigi or something like that. We allude to a lot of that in the Rocks Were There Volume 2. All of it. There's a whole listing of feathered theropods and stuff in there. There's just a compendium of information available that we are doing the same shtick for the new book, and making sure that it's extremely well indexed, and some neat little charts along the way when you need to see things put together. That's like the stuff that we'll be having, charts that you won't see anywhere else. I don't know that you could find right off the bat a compendium of all the feathered theropods that are known by genera and their chronological range. Nice and neat, not alphabetically, but in relation to the chronology, to where you can realize that there are quite a few of them that predate Archaeopteryx now. And all of that stuff is great for ammunition when you're trying to deal with creationists, to build your self-awareness of the various topics in ways that can poke holes in their apologetics, because we're also discussing it in the context of how creationists avoid this information. And just adding new material in today to the new book on stuff in relation to genetics and biology and biogeography and hadrosaur distribution and the like, that relates to the topics that are coming up in the new book. So it's going to be as meaty as the previous one was. I love those giant isopods that lived at the bottom of the ocean. Oh yeah, there's another bit of a thing that really struck me about particularly young Earth creationist apologetics. It doesn't come up really in the intelligent design movement because they don't think much about the details of the past. It just doesn't bother them. Whereas the young Earth creationists coming in that Henry Morris era, wanting to take the geologic column and somehow squish it down into the young Earth creationist frame, often we're diving into material much more closely, still not close enough. If you look on my website, there's the postings on young Earth creationism and the 3 macroevolutionary episodes, PDF related to that as well. How Gary Parker and others really mangled the sequence of life to where they were implying that critters that are much more advanced had always existed. Whereas if you look at the mix of things from the Cambrian and moving into the Ordovician and all that, it's a tag team of increasing complexity. And you won't spot that unless you look at the more detailed geological material and put things in chronological order. And that is not what you're getting from the creationist community. You're getting a little cartoon. In one case, Gary Parker put up a listing of stuff that does not show Cambrian fauna, and he labeled them as if they were Cambrian. They got big ammonites and a whole bunch of other stuff in there that actually belongs to the next period over. And I don't think he knew what he was doing, but yet he professes to be such knowledgeable on that subject. And Gary Parker's still knocking around, and he's a bit older than I am, I think. And I suspect that I know way more now compared to what he knew then than what he currently knows. He may have deteriorated. New human ancestor. Well, the phylogeny by new human ancestor, I'll tell you this. What you've got in the development of human origins has stayed fairly constant all my lifetime. That what you've got are basal hominids coming in groups where there's a bunch of little sidebars that are happening. So we've pretty much given up the simple view that there's just kind of a single species that turns into another species that turns into another in a simple ladder of progress operating in a vacuum of ecology. No, in fact, what's odd is our world where we end down to say 50, 20,000 years ago, when functionally it's us and the Neanderthals, and then eventually just us, to where the lack of so many species is the difficulty. That wasn't usually the case before. So you had Australopithecines down in Africa, and there's a bunch of little sidebars of that, so much so that it's sometimes pesky to figure out which one is the group that are the precursors to the next one. The vague part, and it's part because of a limited range of fossils, so now we're not getting the preservation that we'd like, is that zone of Homo habilis that still debates on, are they just the most advanced Australopithecines, and how many rival cousins were there during that period. But the overall picture that there is that group in there when our genus is starting to emerge, then it's splitting into a variety of forms where they're fairly clear about the ones that are probably leading off to Neanderthals. I think it's Rudolfensis. And then the other one that's leading off to these are all differentiating off of Homo erectus into our species. And then you've got gene flow going on in various population mixes. Now that we've moved into the era when we actually understand the genetics more and have more information available, we've got the circumstances that you've got humans and a little bit of boinking with Neanderthals, and they're starting just to find the most superficial but still growing fossil representation for the Denisovans, which is another group that contributes to our genome, and then a mysterious third group that so far I haven't seen any examples of anybody finding fossils that would pin down that genome to an actual temporal area and range. They may do that in future paleontology. That wouldn't surprise me, but it would also maybe not surprise me that we never will get, especially if it was a small isolated population. There may be never an example when we have the physical representation for that mystery third group. We'll see. kind of had that. I thought they found another species in Africa after they found. Oh well, yeah, they're indeed. Again, also involves the chronology and distribution of stuff. There's still an ongoing debate as to whether or not how much of human that period, by the time we get down to the Homo erectus period on, how much of that is also going on outside of the Rift Valley and in other areas where they're just starting to do the paleontology. And if you don't realize something has been going on, the range, we know Homo erectus spread all over the place into Asia, and that's a hell of a range to go footing around. It hardly surprises me that there would be population niches that would be spreading out anywhere that was habitable. And so much of North Africa was way more habitable during so many of these ranges. It wasn't a giant desert as it is now. Even in human historic times, the Nile wasn't as bleak as it now is. When they were building the pyramids, there was a lot more greenery around at that phase, and there were big oases and things spreading well out into the Sahara Desert at that stage. Same thing we're dealing with when looking at the distribution of human beings in the Americas, because it's increasingly, I can't say shocking or surprising, but it people were figuring maybe that like the Amazon jungle would have relatively small things and not really people's in settled communities in the way, except at the level that we see in the little remnant groups that are there now. But turns out, no. And given how the dynamics of the climate were shifting, if we jump back 10,000 years, it turns out that there's an awful lot of settlements and agriculture and stuff that went on in there. In the same way that the Yucatan Mesoamericans had way bigger and more communities going on that we can only hint at because they're using LIDAR techniques and other mechanisms for isolating stuff, in the same way that they can use LIDAR techniques to show former settlements in now deserted and arid areas. So all through the Fertile Crescent and stuff that's just covered over with sand, that stuff is showing up in the LIDAR readings, and excavations are then following through on all of that. So we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg as to just how varied and broad cultures are, and that shouldn't really surprise us. That human beings have always had more going on, and physical species and things have had more going on than what we're seeing in the little blips on the scope. So there we go. And so don't be at all surprised about that. The one thing you don't want to do is go overboard on the press announcement, because we know all too often that there's now a clickbait hype quality to way too much of the popular coverage on issues. And it's not that they're making stuff up, but they do tend to kind of overdo a lot of the blips. And this can be true for the BBC, can be true for CNN and a lot of these others when they're trying to riff off. And it, of course, definitely is the case for like Fox News, where a perfectly fine paper about the extent to which dinosaurs were contributing methane excretions in the same way cows do, how much of that was affecting climate, because methane is a greenhouse gas. And that got translated partly because of a overly flippant headline at Fox News to the idea of farting dinosaurs. And that then got riffed on by, I think it was Matt Powell, who turned that into, the scientists are claiming the dinosaurs went extinct because they farted themselves to death. No, Matt. No, that wasn't the case. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe better with truth there. Yeah. So what I do is you can follow along pretty well nicely. The three journals that I pay attention to weekly, directly: Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Science and Nature. Those are the big three items. And they, not so much PNAS, because they are basically discussing their own work. Stuff published in their thing, but Science and Nature both have sections about what's new, what's in the news, and quite a lot of the little sidebar commentary that are in the little opening sections at Nature and Science each week are alluding to cutting edge works that are appearing in other technical journals. So by hitting Science and Nature, you are getting a foot in the door about a lot of new material. And typically then one can track that down, even if in the case of Science or Nature, where they don't have full text available on the summary piece, there'll be the footnotes. And so I've often seen a comment on something in Nature where you can only read like the first couple of lines before you get to the have to subscribe part. Remember, I'm not made of money. But look down in the footnotes section, which is preserved in there, and it's typically a reference to the cutting edge work. You can take that, paste that, and find the original paper, and then you can find out whether it's open access or not. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but that can follow up on the tracking of it. So it speeds up the keeping track of stuff. I pay no attention whatsoever to technical literature that's typically brought up on generic superficial media. Now, there are people who knock around on, like on Twitter, where they are the technical scientists who write the papers. And so they're calling attention to things. And Gutsick Gibbon, Erica, a friend of our little channel, and I'm a friend of hers, she will be keeping her eye out for paleoanthropology material and any controversies and things involved. So all of this is just wonderful. Oh, yeah. Well, and there he was being a secondary jerk. Matt Powell, the argument was originally pushed by Casey Luskin over at the Discovery Institute, and it got reprised by Gunter Beckley, reprising Casey Luskin. Again, it was based on a very sloppy misunderstanding of how small organisms can move from one continent to another by water on floating vegetation mats and strayed logs and all that. And some of these things can be quite big. You can have a vegetation blob that's, 20, 30, 50, 60 feet long, quite massive. And if you've got a critter that's the size of a mouse, which early primates were, then boy, you can have a population of them on a tree stump carried across the ocean. This doesn't happen very often, but it doesn't need to happen very often to happen at all. And that's how some unusual biogeography comes about in redistributions, storms bringing them across. But the idea that they were surfing, or as the picture in Casey Luskin's post at the Discovery Institute had it, a giant full-size chimpanzee at the prow of the Titanic, parody of the Cameron Titanic film. Wow, no. Really misrepresenting the stuff. So the biogeographical and transport issue is a recurring one because it fits in. The creationists and intelligent designers all want to try to undermine the biogeography issue, which has been one of the major dynamics of evolutionary thinking. Why are certain animals in certain places and not in others? Clearly, an area where the Luskins and that tend to avoid is islands, because there it's very specific about how organisms get in there. Yeah, there we go. Doesn't take more than one little pregnant female and that bunch, and away you go. Monkeys were once the size of lorises. Interesting. Yeah, well, all the very basal primates, we're talking about 50, 60 million years ago, whereas this is the period after the KT extinction. The little groups that those are coming from, they're not very big animals, they're certainly not the size of modern arboreal monkeys and gibbons and the lemurs and various other ones. Those would be big critters in the case of a lot of these smaller animals. Some of them are, most mammals, remember, are known only by teeth, because that's the parts that's most durable. So in many instances where the ecology is really unsuitable to preserve complete bodies or anything more than just an occasional stray partial skeleton, you'll have teeth. But fortunately, the teeth dynamics of mammals with our specialized incisors and all that is so diagnostic that they can trace an awful lot of phylogeny just from the bloody teeth. So you find a tiny little molar, boom, and look at the way the cusps are formed, and bingo, you can fit that into a larger context. And that involves a ton of technical literature, which isn't being discussed much in the way in the standard anti-evolution literature. I'll just keep you apprised of the fact that I keep track in my project to what technical papers are cited by the anti-evolutionists. This ranges from non-controversial stuff that they're not actually using for their argument, but they're just stating things that everybody knows, all the way up to the stuff that they're trying to deal with as their smoking guns of admissions of the scientists. And those, by the way, are a relatively small fraction. Total, at the moment, it's running around 6,000 technical papers that have been cited. Of those, easily half are just non-controversial or blatantly misrepresented, and they don't actually say what they are. So now you're whittling down to about a 3,000 range. And of those, they're very tactical about what they bring up, as this week's very example is about, where somebody will bring up a paper on Driscoll and the cats, and it's got way more information in it than the version that's being presented by the creationists. So you end up with my overall measure that stayed quite constant, and I don't think it's going to be surprising if it ever alters, is that the anti-evolution movement is missing 90% of the data field. And this varies up and down from there, depending upon which discipline and topic. Most anti-evolution stuff relates to biology. There's a chunk on cosmology, some more specifically paleontological. The one that's really just, they almost are completely oblivious to, is cognitive research. That one is, which of course relates to why our brains do what they do. You know, you'd think that'd be relevant, that they would want to connect all of that up, but yeah, that doesn't work that way. Another little variable that this remains quite constant, because I keep track of also the scientists that actually do the work and how, for all practical purposes, they aren't anti-evolutionists, that the average technical paper has 0.4 scientists involved. In other words, most all scientific work out of tens of thousands of technical papers that I've bumped into are collaborative in nature. And the bigger league papers on a lot of very specialized topics, like major genetic studies, and that can have just a ream of 100, 200 scientists involved with it, just enormous. Typically, I won't say the least interesting, but stuff that's more likely to be peripheral fringe are ones that are done by just a single author, or maybe a couple, because they're used to writing articles together. And remember, Olin, Brown, and Hollander, 2022, you know, you got the ideologue and the buddy that write the little paper and stick it into a relatively obscure journal that they somehow got into, and away we go. The Stuckley and Thaler, two people who are in a little teeny niche. So those are some of the cues you can get into. Yes, well, the Big Bang element is very interesting because, you know, it's why is there something rather than nothing? And so from their perspective, to have a nothing appear is impossible in principle, and therefore, boop, they've got to be opposed to the Big Bang. Plus, Big Bang chronology is giant length. So it's an event that takes place billions of years ago, and the young Earth creationist doesn't allow that. Now you move over to old Earth creationism and intelligent design, and you get exactly the opposite. They just love the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the creation ex nihilo in the Bible. Yay! See, slam dunk, got it all done. Never mind that the Bible doesn't describe anything remotely like the Big Bang, in anything like the chronology or the details of it, that originally there's just a soup of hadrons and the like, and eventually you form matter and atoms and stars form, and then you have galaxies, and then you eventually have supernovas that produce the material to make solar systems. Isn't nothing inherently unstable? Well, in part, it's that, do we understand what we mean by nothing? And Lawrence Krauss and others would be going into that issue. Is there a something before the nothing? In other words, is the property of what the nothingness is that a singularity is emerging from, or is part of, or was already there, or came to be in? Is there something before time space? Does that have any meaning? Is there another time space before the time space we're seeing now? The answer to that is, we have no way of knowing. And all of the physics basically goes tilt at the point that you reach that little singularity area, and it becomes extremely speculative. And any one of the many options available may or may not turn out to actually be true, or something no one's even thought of. But it doesn't change the benchmark that there was a Big Bang event where the universe commences about 13.7 billion years ago. We have the literal reflection of that in the cosmic background radiation. And that is a unique phenomenon that is only going to occur if there was a Big Bang style event. So the fact that it exists at all, boop, that settles it. And that aspect of it is not discussed in any meaningful way by the various creationists that don't like the Big Bang. And we're going to be going into that in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. That's I'm handling the cosmology section. So anyway, we are at an hour. I think this was a wonderful little discussion that we had going in here, and I didn't have to go off on the paralogs of Phileas Fogg even once. There's still links to it in the thing. Remember, we're coming into the holiday sequence. May I do a shameless plug? Please buy as many of the books for gifts, for donating to the library, for your own personal library, however the case goes along. And they're available both in ebooks and the hardcover material. I'm still a hardcover person. I hate reading books in an electronic format. Let me go ahead and put the advert for our little project up there. Let me get that going. Old Peter was so good to create this neat little advert. And there's our little advert for the thing. I imagine Pete will be coming up with a Model 2 for Volume 2 when we get that out, hopefully later next year. We'll see how all that goes. It's going to be a funky one. My co-author Jackson has been involved with something other than book writing, although he's been involved with the material as well because he's been getting his degree and going for his dissertation and all of that stuff. Erica is in the same boat because she just passed her dissertation and all that. So the youngins that I am associated with are doing their life. And so they've got this, it's not a hobby per se, it's way beyond that. But nonetheless, there are important life things they have to deal with. I, as a retired old fart, have a different dynamic on that. So anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for the wooden penguins. Worry about, we're kind of in an El Nino year now, so I'm crossing my fingers that the fuel bill won't be too high this year, that we'll have a relatively mild winter. That will be very, very helpful and get me through into spring. We'll find all of that out. So anyway, everybody stay safe, and we'll presumably see you next week, in which case I may very well be at my relatives over in Seattle, and that will probably be the case for a couple of weeks. If there turns out circumstances make that impossible and there's no show next week, then you'll already have an idea of why, or you'll have to check to find out whether or not I was struck by an asteroid freak accident in the Snoqualmie Pass. You know, who'd have thunk? But at the moment, I'm hoping that we'll be able to keep the shows up in the weeks to come until I get back into Spokane. So anyway, bye-bye. Stay safe. Have fun. The world is interesting, isn't it? Even if we